but they are primarily administrative. We don't have directly elected regions. We then, of course, have local authorities, 600 and more local authorities, organised at two different scales, so either at the district scale or what is called the county scale. We also used to have metropolitan authorities, which covered a range of urban districts, but each of those authorities were abolished in the 1980s under the governments of Margaret Thatcher. Only one has since been recreated, and that is a strategic authority for the London metropolitan area. What's happening in the middle between the regional and the local scale is that there are a variety of initiatives now to try to develop governance arrangements and strategies at the intermediate scale. So sometimes these are called sub-regions, quite often they are called city regions. And there has been a lot of debates and lots of initiatives trying to promote the idea of strategic collaborations at the city regional or the sub-regional scale. This is quite new in England. We last had this debate in the 1970s when we went through a major reorganisation of local government and created those metropolitan authorities. But since that time, there's been very little attention at the sub-regional or city regional scale. We are now beginning to rediscover that. What hasn't happened so far is the design of policies and programmes around those issues. So we have a number of tentative ways of trying to encourage city regional governance arrangements, city regional strategies through things called, for example, metropolitan area agreements, where local authorities come together, they discuss and bargain with both regional agencies and individual national departments about development strategies. What I think we can see in those tentative moves towards a city regional or sub-regional approach to urban policy is something similar but not as determined as the initiatives which have been taken within London and the super region that surrounds it. But we may be moving towards a much more bargain-based approach to central local government relations as a result of these initiatives. And if we were to come together in 3 years' time, we'd be able to see more clearly just how much impact this approach has had. That's my overall view of where we've been tending in terms of urban policy. What I should add very briefly is that, of course, these initiatives were developed at a time when the national economy was doing extremely well. We had 15 years of national economic growth. What we are now into, of course, is a period of recession. And what is I think beginning to happen is that national government feels it needs to take responsibility to have a relatively centralised approach to responding to the economic downturn, but wants to try and use decentralised units of government, local authorities, sub-regions and the regional agencies to implement a whole range of measures designed to help us recover, to deal with the consequences of the recession and to put in place the sorts of policies which are going to be needed for the next economic upturn. What that's meaning is that, to some extent, we are beginning to recreate some of the elements of direct, explicit urban policy, which until 6 months ago seemed to be fading out of existence. So particularly in the area of worklessness, unemployment and people who are economically inactive, there are a number of programs now which are devised centrally, but the responsibility for delivering them is decentralised. And what that's beginning to create is all the same sorts of issues that we've faced with urban programs in the past, about whether these should be delivered to a central agenda or whether we should have a more decentralised approach. There are already complaints from national departments that local delivery is not doing what they thought it should do. So we may have we may have something of a return to direct and explicit urban programmes, but these seem to be a crisis measure more than anything else. I would expect that in the longer term, and particularly when we face a public expenditure crisis in 2 years' time, on the basis of all the borrowing we're now doing to try to cope with the crisis, the tendency will again be towards a more decentralised approach. That's my overall comment. I want to try and respond to your particular questions as well. Question one, which is about how urban issues are dealt with. I think your box describes very well the very different approaches that are taken to urban issues, depending on whether we're talking about direct or indirect responses, or explicit or implicit responses. So we could easily populate the boxes in your figure with particular illustrations of policy initiatives which try to respond to urban issues. But with the overall trend, as I've just described, away from the direct and explicit to what I would argue is direct and implicit. What the government insists is indirect and implicit sorts of urban policies. So the question of whether those urban initiatives are important or not, it really depends which of those boxes we're trying to describe. I think at one point the direct and explicit urban programmes were seen as important nationally and internationally, but the fact remains, I think, that those programmes were always quite marginal in terms of their size. They were never financed particularly heavily. They tended to be experimental. So I would argue that the sorts of initiatives which appear in those other boxes are more important than the things which the UK and England were famous for internationally, which is all about that sort of the urban programme, the experimental approach. The new initiatives that have been undertaken, I think I've already described. There is a tendency towards a decentralised approach where the importance of city regions and sub-regions has become extremely important. And the initiatives which are being developed to respond to the crisis tend to be more traditional approaches, central funding of initiatives in particular areas of the country through a decentralised route. If I move to the second question, which is a very big question and an interesting one, are national urban strategies actually possible? I think the debates in England in particular in recent years has begun to make us aware that we somehow have to take a defensible and sensible position about the way in which we see the national economy developing spatially. We need to take account of the fact that we now live in a knowledge economy which is driven primarily by the major metropolitan areas. But we also have to accept that in the transition to a knowledge economy, some urban areas have done much better than others. I think a degree of realism about the performance and prospects of different territories within the national context has been missing from most urban policy in the past, but is beginning to appear, I think, as we move towards a more decentralised approach, which is more about bargaining between central and local government.